Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going to be recapping the Japanese Grand Prix. My guest is Lindsay, who you may know as Legally F1 on TikTok or Instagram, and I really enjoy her content, so I'm excited to have her and her kind of different perspective on the show today. So everyone please say hi to Lindsay and welcome her to the show.
Thanks, Marissa. I'm so happy to be here.
Of course. I'm so glad you were open to coming on. I really enjoy your content because it's a different type of content than I would normally consume, because I don't think I've seen anyone else kind of go for the legal aspect of F1 and be able to explain those types of things. And I think F1 in particular is such a business heavy sport. There's so many things that go into the sport that have to do with the business side of things. So it's really interesting to have that perspective.
I appreciate that. And yeah, that was kind of the niche I saw that was missing in all of the F1 related content that I was consuming on TikTok and Instagram, and kind of what propelled me to start making videos in the first place, because there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Well, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions just so everybody can get to know you. And the first thing I always check in on is how did you get into F1?
So my dad has been a big F1 fan for a while. And so when I was in college and law school, I remember being home on the weekends and coming out to the family room, and he would have the F1 races on, and I would kind of just sit and watch a little and ask him some questions, but was never really too into it. And then I believe it was after the 2021 season, my dad was like, okay, you really need to watch Drive to Survive on Netflix. I really think that you would enjoy F1 as a sport, just with all of the technical aspects, the behind the scenes drama. And so I watched Drive to Survive and was instantly hooked. And I've been dedicated, spending my weekends glued to the TV, watching F1 ever since.
I like that your dad was I think so many people have talked about Drive to Survive on this show so far. And so much of it is about that personal connection and almost sort of a crash course in everything that you can get to know both the drivers, the basics, and the teams. And I love that your dad was like, this will do it. If you just can get a personal connection, you'll watch this sport with me.
Yeah. And sports has always been something that my dad and I have connected on. And so I definitely appreciate and I'm thankful that he pushed me to watch Drive to Survive and to get into it, because I can't imagine having spent the last 2 years not watching F1, and just the places it's taken me, the people that I've been able to meet through the online community. It's just been incredible.
Oh, I love that. Well, do you and your dad support the same team and drivers, or did you end up picking separate ones? Which ones are they?
So he is a diehard McLaren fan. And I have to say, I am coming around on McLaren a lot. I think I wasn't a huge fan of Lando when I first started. I'm going to be completely honest, but I think because
Wow.
he's really I don't know. I think I've just seen a lot of maturity from him just in these last two seasons, especially with Oscar as his teammate. And it's made me kind of turn the corner on him. And I also think Oscar is great. So I've definitely become much more of a McLaren supporter, but I am a Ferrari girl through and through.
That's so fair. Are you a Ferrari team, or are you going to have a struggle when Carlos picks where he's going next year?
I definitely am more Ferrari as a team. So I also love Lewis. So we'll be very happy to see Lewis and Charles racing next to each other next year. But we'll also still have the support for Carlos with whatever team he chooses. I'm kind of an equal opportunity fan. There's nobody that I really dislike or am not rooting for on the grid.
That's so fair. I like that. I think F1 is one of the few sports where that's the case, where it's because there's both a team and an individual aspect to the championships, you can actually say I kind of don't mind if this person or this person is doing well. I'm rooting for success across the board.
Yeah, I always struggle with that last 10th place point, because I feel so many times it's between Yuki and Alex. And I'm oh, I want Yuki to get it, but oh, that means Alex doesn't get it. And I will have this internal struggle with myself, because I just want everybody to do well and have fun.
Yeah, you're I just want everyone to go out there and be somebody. Did you have a good time? It counts.
Yes, exactly.
I love it. It's a very soccer mom approach to supporting very, very fast, intense driving.
Yeah, 100%.
I love it. Well, we can get into the race again. This was an interesting lead up, I felt, because last race was so dramatic and so intense that this almost felt huh, I guess we're back. There was still definitely things to talk about, definitely still some like, some drama, but we're right back to kind of Max at the top of the charts across the board, qualifying, free practice, like he is.
Yeah, that was kind of the takeaway I wrote down. I was like, Red Bull back to dominating. There was a lot of good from the race, but like nothing will beat that, like the shock of Max's brake failure in Australia, and just like everybody, the realization that everybody had of what it meant for potentially getting somebody else to win.
Yeah. I think it was just like, even though we had it was not an uneventful race weekend, it still felt like almost, just not as big of a deal. Like it felt kind of like a letdown almost, or like an energy shift. I guess not a letdown. I don't want to not see Max compete. Like I want to see everybody compete against the best. But every once in a while it's kind of nice to have the shakeup. And I was like, okay, we're back to business as usual.
Yeah, I think an energy shift is a good way to describe it, kind of going back to the norm, so to speak.
Yeah, just a return to the norm for sure. Well, we do have one little piece of like carryover drama, which is like this legend of Williams's cursed chassis, which I think we'll be continue talking about for years to come.
I don't even know if it's just the cursed chassis. It's Williams as a whole seems to be cursed at this
I
point.
know. It's interesting because I feel like we saw this year at the start, there was like this hope that Williams was in a good place. That we saw, the new wheel development. We saw some big leaps. It felt like James Vowles really had a plan. And I don't think that he doesn't have a plan. I think we're really seeing the effects of cost to this team that just does not have the money to support it.
Yeah, it's definitely showing the fact that they have been operating at such a detriment for so long. And no matter what James does, like it's just not a hole that they can crawl out of overnight. It's going to
Yeah.
take years and years of rebuilding. And the chassis is just one example of that.
Yeah, and I think so like before we got to Suzuka, we knew that obviously last week Logan's car was given to Alex after Alex crashed it. They weren't able to repair it and they didn't have a spare chassis. We went back and repaired Alex's car. And then I saw quite a bit of a response to the fact that Williams announced that Logan would actually be driving the repaired chassis and not have his car given back to him. We saw like this response to it. So I'm curious what you felt about it, because I saw sort of two sides of the argument, which was one side was like, obviously there's still something wrong with the car. Otherwise they would give Logan back his car and give Alex the repaired chassis. And then there were other people basically saying like they already did all of the work to reset the cars to each other. Like, so they had to change some of the pieces to give Logan's chassis to Alex. They had to move Alex's seat into the car. They had to move a couple of other pieces to be compliant with the rules. And so it would make less sense time wise to kind of reset everything and to like give Logan back his original car, give Alex his repaired chassis, because they'd have to basically take everything apart again. Did you have a feeling one way or the other going into the race?
I definitely thought of it in like more of the logical way, and that to me it made sense because from whichever perspective you look at it, whether it be the repair chassis might have an inherent like weight disadvantage, for example. I know that was one thing a lot of people are talking about, or just the fact that yeah, they already put this work in. I think that a lot of people had a really emotional response and were thinking that it was very unfair. But again, and this was the same thing with the decision that was made in Australia. Just from a team perspective, it makes the most sense to prioritize Alex and the cost in that way.
Point that you're making about like the shifted kind of response is really interesting, because if you look at the social media just alone from like regarding Logan prior to Australia to both Australia and this weekend at Suzuka, you have this like extreme shift in terms of public opinion regarding Logan. Because if you look at anything before Australia, every response to Logan is, why does he have a seat? He's not a good driver. They shouldn't have brought him back. Why did Williams bring him back for another year? He's so like, he's just always last. And then as soon as something that was viewed as unfair happened to him, now the response is, how dare Williams give him back a broken chassis? How, like, why would they do this to him? Justice for Logie Bear. Like, there is such an extreme shift, which like ultimately actually didn't come from any performance change on Logan's side. It just came from like this perception of something unfair has happened and now he deserves justice.
Yeah, that was super jarring to me because Logan was never, in my perspective, one of the more popular drivers on the grid. I think most
No.
people were either indifferent to him or had lots of negative things to say. So I was very shocked to see just how much public outcry there was over the situation in Australia. And then again with the repaired chassis, I just kind of had no idea where it came from, but that just shows how quickly things move in F1 and how people are always on to the next talking point in this sport.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen a couple of creators talk about similar issues, and they've talked about it in the sense of like a recency bias is how they phrased it. There were, I think, McKenna was one that talked about this, and there were a couple of other creators. But there was this conversation over the idea that like in F1, it seems like a lot of times the fan bases and sometimes the press too seem to like forget things that happened more than a week ago or more than last race weekend, and it just continually shifts right back to what's happening right now. And I think a lot of people feel that when they're talking about like the conversation about Carlos and Ferrari, and this idea that Ferrari is really going to regret their decision. And it's interesting because it's like they're not. It's not like they didn't make a decision to go with like another rookie. They made a decision to go with Lewis Hamilton, who's just arguably an economic benefit to any team that he's on, and also just obviously a seven-time world champion. It's one of those things where it's fascinating where we're seeing people look at it and say like basically only the stuff that happened within the last two races is relevant in this conversation.
We're definitely seeing like the phrase "you're only as good as your last race" really be embodied in this season. And yeah, the conversation around Carlos is also one that has been shocking because I think any team would do absolutely anything they could to have seven-time world champion Lewis Hamilton as one of their drivers, no matter how good their two current drivers are. Like, there's just no question.
Yeah, it's like it's the same conversation about Max. Like if you have the chance to have the highest caliber driver available on your team, it doesn't really matter who you have to give up to have it. So it's interesting. And then unfortunately, like to go back to Logan and Williams, we obviously saw that like that repaired car was crashed in FP1. There was not chassis damage. They were able to get him back for the race, but like he went into the wall, he lost control. But on that conversation of everybody kind of viewing it their own way and now being like pro Logan, something I found really interesting was everybody was watching the onboard footage of that crash, and I saw so many people saying you can see that he turned the wheel and it just didn't respond. And I don't know that that's true or not true. It's hard. Like I personally don't feel like I know enough about like I've never been behind the wheel of an F1 car. I can't look at it and tell you like he did what he was supposed to do and the car crashed anyway. And it's interesting to see the response being so adamant that he did nothing wrong when literally 2 weeks ago the boy could not do anything right in the eyes of the public, not in the truth.
I also saw that internet sleuthing, which again, like you said, I also don't know enough about F1 to know whether he did or did not turn the car, but I read enough commentary from experts in the sport who said that he was taking an incorrect line and there was a driver error that was inherent that caused that crash. So I was kind of surprised that the response was jumping to his defense rather than people kind of flipping back to what it was before and criticizing
Yeah.
him like relentlessly.
I will say I'm as much as I think that the shift was, and especially in this incident, like factually incorrect, I am happy to see Logan not getting hate anymore because I thought I like Logan. Like I think Logan's a fun guy, and he is not as bad as people have made him out to be. Like he has had some moves where things were impressive. He did score his first point last year, technically on a technicality, but that's not the point. Like he did score the first point, and he has been putting the effort in to improve, I will say. And it's so hard to watch someone just get nonstop hate for really nothing. Like it's he hasn't, made these horrible statements or proven himself to be a bad person or anything like that. And it's interesting. So I am glad regardless of like how it happened, to see the public opinion shifting away from him getting so much hate. Um, but it is interesting that it's now like this is our child whom we must protect at all costs, and he can do nothing wrong.
Yeah, I also am happy to see the move away from the criticism. I don't think any driver deserves to get that kind of online criticism and hate unless they, of course, do something that is worthy of criticizing. But just being slower than your teammate and maybe crashing one too many times is not worthy of relentless criticism online.
Truly. And you know what? And also, this is like a perfect segue in terms of like talking about relentless, like aggressive criticism purely for being slower than your teammate. We are seeing Checo, I thought this week, closing that gap to Max in the Red Bull. And Checo has been going into this season, there was just this like understanding that it didn't matter what he did, he's not keeping his seat. He's just so much worse than Max. There's no way that he belongs on this team. And in qualifying, they were half a tenth apart. Like there was this close to them being able to see Checo on pole instead of Max, which I thought was shocking, but also another one of those pieces of conversation that we're seeing where people are saying like, he doesn't deserve a seat, he doesn't deserve this car, he's so much worse. They need someone who can really be a teammate to Max, and we're kind of seeing him prove them wrong to some degree.
Yeah, I think that this weekend was a really huge step in the right direction for Checo. And just so far this season, he's been doing much better than he was towards the end of last year's season. We, of course, now know that there was some floor damage that he was dealing with in Australia that hindered his ability to be on the podium or even win in Max's absence. But I've never understood the Checo criticism either, because he has shown throughout his long career in the sport that he is a very respectable driver. And I think that he is fully deserving of that second Red Bull seat. And it's hard to say that, I know that it was touch and go for a bit last year, but it's hard to say that he's not a worthy like second driver to Max when he's still coming in P2 in the championship and they're winning the constructors by a mile.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see if he's able to kind of hold this success of this season, because as we know, like last season, towards the end, as you were saying, there was a very different level of performance. And I do think there's a level of the fact that he's driving knowing he's competing to keep his seat, and that there are quite a few very high caliber drivers available, like Carlos, like other, when you look down the line, I think it's more than 70% of the drivers this year, their contracts are up. So it's sort of like a pick of the litter, whoever they want, type of situation. And so we know that he's driving with that in mind, but it'll be interesting to see when Red Bull makes that decision for next year, like how early on they lock someone down and who that person is. Because I think Checo's performance so far would at least make me pause before signing someone else.
I think that last year, especially towards the end, Checo really started to get in his head a little bit with his competition with Max, because he was so competitive towards the beginning of the season. But then Max, of course, being Max, just started to run away with it. But we have seen Checo be a great teammate to Max in 2022 and, of course, in 2021 when he did a significant role in helping Max to win that first world championship. And so this, again, I think comes to the recency bias where people are just thinking of the second half of Checo's last season. And I think that he deserves that seat as long as this performance keeps up. The only thing that would give me pause is that it seems like Christian Horner has a lot more power in that Red Bull organization than most people thought. I don't know if that's a shift or if that's kind of how it's always been and we just haven't been aware of it. But the only concern there would be that Christian just has closer relationships with some of the other drivers on the grid. So I think that would be maybe where the concern for Checo might come, is that there might be more politics at play and it might not just be all about the driving.
Yeah, one thing I would say on that side that I'm curious about is like recently Max has been continued to ask like, "Oh, are you going to try to go for 8 championships? Are you going to try to beat this, long-standing record?" And his response has sort of been like, "No." And so I do wonder how much Red Bull also is starting to think about what life after Max looks like. There's been so much conversation of like Max being offered a seat at Mercedes and Toto just nonstop talking about that. And what they would offer and all these different things. And so I do wonder if it's starting to spark a feeling at all, or like a thought process whatsoever of what does the longevity of Red Bull look like after Max? Because right now, obviously, you've got Max, you have Adrian Newey, who also is meeting with other teams right now, and like has had a rumor has it a number of meetings with Ferrari, and that like if any one piece of this like all-star team decides to leave, what is their plan moving forward? And so I do wonder, do we see a driver that goes into that seat or goes into like who goes into that Checo seat that's currently occupied, that conversation would be more about what are we going to do if Max leaves, or what are we going to do when Max leaves, more so. Do we have kind of a balance or something figured out for that? That would be the other thing I think might come into play.
That's where I see Carlos being a potential fit for that Red Bull seat, because he is a good deal younger than Checo. So he has some more of that longevity. And him and his father also have the Red Bull ties. I mean, he started his career out at Toro Rosso, but the longevity of Red Bull as a whole definitely seems to be a bit concerning when you really look at it, because they have even like their driver development program really isn't like that strong when you look at the drivers in F2 and F3. And they've even publicly said that they're like cutting back on their young driver program. So it seems like they've put all of their eggs in the Max basket, but Max definitely doesn't have all of his eggs in the Red Bull basket.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And it's interesting too, because it's like when we look at what I think everyone expected to happen for next year, like I think everyone expected Danny Rick is going to move up into that Checo seat. And then you have the Max and Danny dynamic that worked well before until Danny wanted to be kind of like the star of the team. And then you have Liam Lawson moving into the V carb seat. And then you sort of do have like a bench, like a deeper bench at that point. But I think Red Bull also, unfortunately, like their method is not one that is like very supportive of drivers being developed. It's very much a demand for performance. And if you're not performing, there really is not, publicly at least, we don't know what happens behind closed doors, but publicly there is not a support of, they'll get them next time. When you look at it from the side of like the way James Vowles talks about Logan versus the way Red Bull talks about their drivers that maybe not be performing, like when Nick DeVries was having his issues, and as opposed to trying to solve it or give him a full season, they dropped him in the middle of it. And so I think there is sort of that issue also makes you wonder, like, how many drivers have they left on the table because they were just already not, as opposed to like being willing to develop them, they were not willing to put in that effort. They're looking for people who are 100% on their own successful.
Yeah, Red Bull definitely has that like chew you up and spit you out type vibe going for them. And I was listening to a podcast, and I can't remember which podcast it was. And now it's killing me that I can't give them the proper credit. But they were talking about Yuki and how, yeah, he got that seat because of the Honda backing. And he kept that seat for the first couple of years because of the Honda backing. But he is proof that if you just put time and effort into actually developing a young driver, they can come around and they can be successful. Like Yuki should be a teaching moment for Red Bull and the Red Bull organization to say, like, look, if you just give them time, they will become good drivers and become the drivers that you want them to be. They just need to have the chance to show it and to kind of come into their full potential, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. And we saw Yuki out-qualify Daniel today too, which is Danny's been in the sort of fold for a significantly longer period of time than Yuki has. And we saw Yuki out-qualify on his home turf, which is great.
Yeah, I believe Yuki is, what are we, 3 races in now? Has he out-qualified Daniel in all 3 races so far?
This was
Or is this
race
4 races?
4. Yeah, 4 races. And yes, I do think he has out-qualified Daniel in every race.
Yeah, I think that most people expected that to be the other way around. So Yuki is
Absolutely.
really like proving himself against a reputable opponent with Daniel and occupying that other seat.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of Daniel, if we want to get into the race itself, literally the very beginning of the race, we have Daniel Ricciardo and Alex Albon crash into each other and put in, I think, almost a 25-minute red flag stoppage situation. Which also now post race, it has been confirmed the Williams chassis has been damaged. So now we're both chassis, because Alex was again driving not the car that he crashed, but the original Logan car. And so now that chassis is also damaged and will have to be repaired. So when we go into China, hopefully we'll have both of them, but both of them will be repaired chassis, and we will not have a spare until at least Miami is the situation at moment.
Yeah, I really hope that Williams is able to turn these chassis repairs around in time. I would think just based off of the crashes themselves, this would be like a less intense repair than what they had to do after Australia because this seemed to be more head on versus Alex's crash in Australia, where the car was kind of like whipped around and seemed to be like there was a lot more contact like on the side and to the suspension and things like that. But that's why I said at the top that it seems like Williams as a whole is cursed and it's not just like that particular chassis because they just cannot seem to catch a break with anything. And I sincerely hope that they are able to repair it in time for Shanghai.
Yeah, I feel like they should be able to. Hopefully, it's also required. Like they have to ship it back to the UK, then they have got to ship it back to China to get it there in time. And so I'm nervous because do we see another situation where we only have one Williams car on the grid? And obviously, based on previous choices, that would be Alex. And does Logan's like support group become stronger than ever? Possibly, but I'm hopeful that we see that car repaired in time. But I do wonder what this does in terms of like production of the spare because we've now spent both last kind of 2 weeks and this now space in between the next race rebuilding what we already have for Williams. So are they also taking time away from like the changes they need to be making, the development choices they need to be making, the spare parts situation? Like there's only so much that can be done at once. So I do worry what this means for the future of the rest of the season for them.
I hadn't really even thought about that at all, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were definitely some long-term effects with like delayed upgrades and even a potentially a delay of the spare chassis because of all of this.
Yeah. The other part of this is Daniel Ricciardo, which we kind of have already started to like touch on. But one thing that whether it's the public, whether it's Red Bull, or whether it's the cameramen behind the F1 cameras, people are really starting to talk about whether or not Daniel is even going to make it through the end of this season, or if they're going to bring Liam Lawson in. And I'm assuming from your laugh that you also caught that every single time they like were panning from the crash to Liam, from Danny in his like regular clothes to Liam. Like there's just this like almost the camera almost reminded me of like when you watch a nature documentary and they pan from like the gazelle to the cheetah that's on its way to eat them. Like not that Liam or Danny was doing anything to give that energy, but the camera was just like panning 100% into this world where it's like, by the way, Liam's here and he's ready.
To me, it gives like, I don't know if you heard the phrase, like it's like the devil works hard, but Chris Jenner works harder. It's like the devil works
Yes.
hard, but the F1 camera operators work harder because like the way that they kept doing that, they were like, they knew Daniel was in the hot seat, and just the amount of memes I've seen, it's like Liam on his way to steal Daniel's job. It just like, I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm going to enjoy the internet content that comes from it because Liam did just seem always like to be there right at the right time, like behind Daniel constantly. And so it's giving us those perfect like social media moments.
I will say, like, the one thing factually that's interesting to me is that I did see someone point out that the gaps between Danny and Yuki are the same as the gaps were between Yuki and Nick DeVries when they did replace Nick with Danny in terms of like qualifying and pace. And so that if history repeats itself is an interesting situation. And also kind of to what you were saying earlier about them not really having like there is this lack of a plan for the future. Do we see them try to test Liam if they once they determine that Danny is not the future of the team in the way that they may have thought that he was? I don't know. I think what sucks about it is that there is a possibility of that happening. I think I don't know that it will purely because of how much goodwill Daniel Ricciardo seems to have with Red Bull in an interesting way. I think specifically with Christian Horner, there's a level of just like he seems to really care for Daniel in a way that it doesn't seem to apply to the other drivers other than Max. And it's interesting because they very much did keep Danny around and employed for a period of time when he did not have a seat in F1 after his situation with McLaren. And I don't know, it'll be interesting to see. I do feel like if you compare the two, if he keeps his seat for the whole season, it feels more like an interpersonal choice, not a talent choice, unfortunately.
I agree. And I hadn't seen those comparisons. And that's actually quite shocking because I feel like looking back on last season, my perception was that Nick DeVries was so much further behind than how I feel Daniel is. But I don't know if necessarily Red Bull needs to like test the bench, so to speak, because they already know and can be fairly confident in what Liam Lawson can do, because we did get to see him in that seat head to head against Yuki last season, and he did
Yeah.
well. But like you said, I think that the interpersonal connection is what's going to save Daniel regardless. And I think that's ultimately what ended up hurting Nick DeVries, because he didn't come from any sort of Red Bull background. He was kind of just brought into that seat on a whim, so to speak, off of that performance subbing for Alex in Monza. So I think that was probably what made it easy to cut Nick loose so quickly. But that's also what's going to make it hard to do the same for Daniel.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, and I think, like, I haven't, like, really dove deep into those comparisons in terms of, like, numbers, and I've just seen a lot of people kind of comparing the numbers on the internet, so I'm trusting the internet, which is never a good choice, but, you know, but yeah, it is I do think there is that, like, with this particular situation, it feels a little bit about, like, it's not what you know, it's who you know type of situation, and to be totally fair to Danny, he does have a level of history of being a very good driver, of being a race winner, and the time that he has been successful, and he's been on sort of just this long downswing since he left Red Bull in the first place. But yeah, I do think it feels very much like what's keeping him in that seat is his relationship with the team versus his performance, because he's getting knocked out before he's not making it all the way to Q3. He's in the back half of the grid. I mean, as much as we talk about Logan, he's sort of like in the back with Logan most of the time. With the only thing that's really kind of changing his ability is where Stake is losing time in these pit stops, and so you're seeing two cars that are just going to be last no matter what. Then you've got sort of the Williams situations, and then I mean Daniel's down there with everybody else, and it would be and then today, obviously, I do think upon rewatching the crash and watching sort of the expert response to the crash, it was very much like a racing incident. It wasn't that Daniel did anything wrong, but it is still another race where they're not getting points from him. So I don't know.
I don't want to discredit Daniel and any of the accomplishments he's had in his career, because he has had a very good career, most of that coming with Red Bull. And then he, of course, had that win at McLaren. But to me, it unfortunately just seems like he's past his prime. And I think he did spend maybe some of those prime years in teams that just like didn't have the potential in the car that Red Bull did. And so it is really unfortunate to see, but it just seems like he doesn't really have that it factor anymore. And he is one of the older drivers on the grid, and you have to take that into account as well. So
Yeah,
it'll be
that's very
interesting
true.
to see what happens with all of that.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where it all ends up. I do think if, as you said, the double works hard, but the F1 cameraman works harder, and the only thing they seem to like more than Charles's eyes in his visor or Carlos's was Liam Lawson this weekend. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think no matter what race Liam is at, we'll be seeing him and his looks behind the scenes, no doubt.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, and I don't know that that's bad. I think one thing I do think is coming from this, like, dominance of Max, which again, like, I think F1 consistently has dominant eras. We've had this sort of debate going on, is Max Verstappen the reason that watching F1 is boring right now? And then the counter argument is that there's always periods of dominance, like before this was Mercedes and Lewis and everything like that. But I do think one of the things that is coming out of basically knowing who's going to win every single race is that the sport itself, whether that's the fans, whether that's the press, whether that's the cameramen, are looking for other places to imply drama and storylines when the race itself is not giving that to you, at least for P1 and P2. And I do think part of that is where this is coming from. It's like we aren't talking about who's going to be world champion, who's going to win the constructors championship, which is the core concept of this sport. So if you don't have those things to talk about, like, maybe it is a little bit more interesting to talk about whether or not Liam Lawson is going to take over, or to pan here or pan this way, and do these sort of like almost Curb Your Enthusiasm style cuts of of like showing one driver to the next as a threat. it feels like they're hunting for drama because there isn't any on the very front of the field.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that is a bit unfortunate because if you look beyond Red Bull and first and second, I think that there is a lot of good on track drama and competition. I mean, we saw it with the amount of overtakes and like strategy that was involved in today's race. So I think that it's unfortunate that everybody this season, especially, seems to have turned to the off track drama because there still is exciting racing happening. It's just, I mean, as much as it sucks, not happening for first.
Exactly. I agree with that. Well, speaking of the midfield, we should talk about Mercedes' hard tire strategy, which, if you can't hear it in my voice, I am exhausted by it. I was so frustrated because we watched them put during that like the red flag stop. You could have done anything you wanted. You had 20 minutes to do whatever you like. And they were like, what if we put on the hardest, coldest tires and we go with a one stop strategy that ultimately won't be a one stop. We're going to let everyone pass us, and then after that we'll put on some more tires that won't let us catch anyone. I just was so exhausted by it.
I literally wrote down Mercedes, yikes, in like the notes that I jotted down for myself for this podcast, because this also isn't the first time that we've seen Mercedes do this. Like, we're going to like outsmart everybody on strategy and go for a one stop. It's what they did in Coda too with Lewis. And the same thing happened is they got like 10 laps or whatever after like the pit stop window. And then we're like, oh, your tires are dead. We're going to pit you now and just completely ruin your race. Like, I don't understand when they're going to realize that this is not something that's going to work for them. Like,
I
yeah,
just
that car, and also that car has never been good on hard tires. For as
no.
long as I
Oh,
can remember
sorry.
watching the sport, the Mercedes does not like hard tires. Like, that is just a fact. So I don't know what they thought.
It was so frustrating. And then you also have like just I was like, of all the options that you have, this is the worst possible one to go with, and there's nothing we can do about that.
And I feel like every time they commit to some sort of strategy like this, they do it with both of their drivers. Like, at least do a mixed bag so that if
Yes.
your strategy gamble doesn't work, you at least have one driver that like has a chance. But it seems like every time they do something like this that's like super drastic, they do it for both and then they both just get screwed.
Yes, I agree. It's like there's no I don't understand where the like lack of splitting has come, because also of course there was splitting before when we were splitting the setups and we were seeing such a poor performance from Lewis's car. But then when it actually counts, like we're not splitting the tire strategy, and it's a strategy that whatever, I'm sure someone had a number that said we should put on hard tires, but you're looking at everybody else who is further up the field than you do the opposite. It's just so fascinating, and I don't get it, and it's almost like watching Mercedes like intentionally implode. Like the choices seem like they don't make any sense. No one's listening to various feedbacks. We've continued to see Lewis be like, please change this strategy. Please change this about the car. Please fix this. And there's just nothing being brought in that makes any sense. And so I don't know what the choices are, what the deal is, or why it's happening. And I also kind of wonder if this is just like last year the same thing was happening. It's just been more public this year and more clear because of the fact that Lewis is leaving. But regardless, like it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, I don't care who makes the choice, but we've got to start making some choices to win races at some point, or even just at least not lose them. Like I don't know.
Yeah, I have two kind of like, I guess, rhetorical questions in response to that. My first being that were they ever really great at strategy all along, but it was just kind of hidden by the fact that they had like a dominant car? Like, this could have been something that has been lacking in Mercedes, like as an organization, basically from the get go, but we just haven't known until now because their car has just been so dominant for so long. And then the second question is that, is this just desperation and they are just trying to do anything to scrape by and be competitive with Ferrari and McLaren, that they're just making these crazy decisions, like just being desperate that they'll work out and get some sort of an edge?
Yeah, I am curious about both of those things. And the other thing I think also that I do wonder is when James left, who took over, and is that part of this shift? Because we're seeing it's been, about the same timeline since James Vowles left. And I do wonder, like, the shift between losing James, going with George instead of Valtteri, and making that shift, which we know Lewis was against. Like, we know that, I think he's treated George with respect and as a teammate, but we've heard him say, like, I think Valtteri should have kept the seat. And in that conversation, obviously that was ignored. And so I do wonder, like, was it some of what we've been talking about when it comes to what Red Bull might be starting to think about, which is, what do we do after Lewis leaves? What do we do after Max leaves? Did some of those changes backfire? Like, did they go away from a team pairing that was winning because they were willing to work together? You have Valtteri and you have Lewis, and you had this team that was willing to make team decisions together, versus you have George, who tends to complain about team decisions over the radio, is the nicest way I can put it. And you've lost James, you've changed some people in the garage. And I do just wonder, like, is everything in their attempt to, like, plan ahead for Lewis leaving, did they lose a number of years of success that they could have had before he left? Because you have, like, the fact that they didn't want to give him what he asked for when it came to the amount of years. We've seen Toto very much blatantly admit that the reason he didn't want to give Lewis 2 years is because he wanted a seat for Kimi Antonelli. It's been clear that he still regrets losing Max to Red Bull because they didn't have a seat for him. And I do wonder, like, okay, yeah, you're planning ahead poorly. And now you probably, if you had left Valtteri and Lewis in those seats and continued to listen to everyone about the car up until that point, could they have won at least one more championship before they made all these changes?
I think that George and Lewis could have been a really good and strong driver pairing if Toto had been upfront with George at the start and said,
Mm.
yes, I know you have ambitions. I know you want to be a world drivers champion someday, but you're going to be number two to Lewis Hamilton for a couple of years, and that's just going to be how it is. Toto could have had that conversation. Maybe they did have that conversation. We just don't know about it. But I think that if they would have had that conversation and set the expectations like from the get go with George, it could have been more of a symbiotic relationship. But if that conversation didn't happen, which I'm not led to believe that it did based on how things have transpired the last few years, it really shows that this trouble and kind of like idea of moving on from Lewis has really been brewing for a lot longer than we think, which is also just crazy to me, and crazy that Toto's mentality was that we're going to get rid of seven-time world champion Lewis Hamilton for rookie Kimi Antonelli and not George Russell. Like, the fact that
Yeah.
like they were just like going to be so quick to get rid of Lewis is absolutely shocking to me, when all we've learned over the past few years with these new regulations is that every complaint has had about the car has been correct. Every time Lewis has suggested something, a technical fix to the car, and they've implemented it, it has improved the car. So like, I just don't understand what they are doing.
Yeah, and it's also like, what's so frustrating about it is, you're right. We have continued to see that every complaint that was made was correct. There, all of these choices, and like, to reference Drive to Survive, because one of the things that I think is great about Drive to Survive is we do get a lot of footage of driver interviews that we would not get without the show, because it wouldn't be the same type of kind of sit down conversation questions that we get. And we had Lewis, ironically, in this like, in last season, he's talking about, whether or not he should leave, and decides ultimately to stay, which we know does not last for very long. But in that conversation, you do have this, like, sit down piece with him where he says, like, I kept being told I was wrong, and I felt like I was stepping on people's toes, so I backed off, and then, like, we lost, like, nonstop. Like, we're just continuing to lose, and it turns out that, like, what I was asking for was right. And it's frustrating because I don't really see, like, what the path was, because you see, like you said, I'm not led to believe that George was given that conversation about being number 2 to Lewis until a certain point, or until Lewis retired. Which, on the flip side, when you listen to Charles talk about the move, it's clear that he is willing to kind of take that back seat for a couple of years until Lewis retires, and he sees the benefit in doing that, and learning from Lewis and what Lewis can bring to the team. And I think also he sees the benefit in Lewis having one more championship before he retires, and what that legacy means for Ferrari and for F1 as a whole. And it's interesting because, we don't know what conversations are being had, and I don't think that you see really, like, tension tension between George and Lewis. And I don't know how much of that is just that Lewis is, resigned to leaving at this point or what, but there isn't that same level of tension that you would necessarily see between like Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki or further down the line. But you do see George's, I don't know if it's him trying to like put this out there and hope that people believe him, but he continues to talk about like how close he is with Toto and like volunteers the fact that he sleeps over at Toto's house frequently and that he's seeing all the drivers calling Toto and he's so involved in this decision and all of that. And so some of that could be him, trying to make the press believe that he's the number one. But when you look at the people that they're talking about, Toto is talking about Max like very loudly. Max even referenced that in post race press this week and was like, yes, Toto's had a lot of nice things to say about me this week and kind of laughed. And you also see them talking about like there's been conversations about the fact that he's had a phone call with Fernando Alonso, with Sebastian Vettel. None of those choices are people that would be taking a back seat to George. So even in this new seat opening situation, the only possible person that we've seen spoken about that would take that Mercedes seat that would be a second to George would be Kimi Antonelli. And it seems like for George, like as opposed to just taking the time to learn from Lewis to play as a team player and make those decisions together. Instead, he like whether it was presented this way or he just wanted it to be this way, it seems like he thought he was going to be the number one seat, and it doesn't really sound like that's what's going to happen regardless this coming now that Lewis is leaving.
I think in some respects, George is like ambitious to a fault. And in a lot of ways, that ambition, especially in a sport like Formula One that's so cutthroat, is a very respectable quality. But I think that there's some situations where it seems like George just like takes it a little too far. And that's kind of like him coming in with the mentality that he's going to just immediately be Mercedes' number one driver behind or ahead of 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. But I also wonder if even if Kimi Antonelli were to come in, if George would still have that like number one driver role, so to speak, because I mean, if Toto was willing to throw away Lewis for Kimi Antonelli, like that kind of shows just like how sold on Kimi he is and the talent that he thinks that Kimi's going to bring. So, I mean, maybe for a season while he's getting acclimated to F1, but I think that tide would shift very quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting to see, like, it feels like to me, the more this unfolds, that like we said, like the choices that were being made to prepare for after Lewis retired kind of ruined their last run with Lewis by preparing too soon, essentially. And now I think they're really suffering for it. And you even have like Fernando, who was in this conversation and asked about, like, oh, are you interested in that Mercedes seat? And he was like, they're behind us. It really does not appeal at the moment. And so it seems like they've not only lost their time with Lewis in order to like have a full finish there and to really bring it home, they've also tarnished their reputation to the point that like drivers aren't necessarily looking at it as like a number one seat in the way they used to.
Yeah, that was an absolutely savage comment from Fernando, especially because I feel like when that seat first opened up, everybody was talking about how great he would be as that like second driver with George. But I really just think that Mercedes seems to be broken beyond repair at this point, and I don't really know. They're not going to be able to do anything about it this season, it seems like, and certainly probably not unless they just miraculously get Max, which I think the chances of that are slimmer and slimmer by the day. I don't know if they're going to be able to do anything about it next season either.
Agreed. I also am wondering, like, in my opinion, I feel like this indecision is going to cause them to be sort of last to make their choice because there's this like desire to see what Kimi does and they have some testing planned and there's like they want to, see if that's going to work out before they make a decision. But Carlos wants his seat resolved now. Fernando is probably going to want to resolve his plans soon. So the longer they wait, the more they're going to lose out on people who are actually performing right now in F1. We've even seen like, I don't know if you've listened to the BBC podcast F1 Checkered Flag that they're doing, but they've been given like a large amount of access to the garage this year. And so they're covering a number of teams, but they did do an episode on Lewis Hamilton's announcement, like when it happened. And I think that was the clip where George was like, I was sleeping over at Toto's house the night before, and then I saw that Lewis was coming over, so I left. It's like, okay. And that information was volunteered in that episode. But Toto was also asked about it, and they asked if he tried to convince Lewis to stay, and he said no. Um, and I wonder how much of it is like ego, like how much of it is them getting in their own way and their own belief that this is the most coveted seat, aside from a Red Bull seat or maybe a Ferrari seat at the moment. How much is it that Toto and the rest of the team leadership believes that our seat is the most coveted other than the Red Bull seat, which Checo is performing well in? Like, we can wait and people will wait for us, and then they're going to be kind of left with the answer that people aren't waiting for them anymore.
I think that maybe that gamble was okay to make 3 years ago, but it's not okay to make now. And I think that we saw time and time again people saying that the best thing that Mercedes could have done was come out and made a statement, so to speak, by giving Fernando a big offer and announcing their driver replacement like right away, or just committing to that next chapter. And their reluctancy to do that, I do think is going to hurt them because they don't have that reputation of being a front runner. I mean, obviously, we know that Red Bull is like really the only true front runner, but at the beginning of the season, people were thinking that they were going to be competitive with Ferrari and McLaren, but it seems like there's a clear divide that they're in that like almost third tier, so to speak, with Aston Martin. So, like you said, Fernando's not going to be lining up for that seat. You maybe would get Carlos, but he's not going to wait around, especially if Red Bull comes knocking. Like they could have had somebody great locked in if they would just committed right away. But I do think that they thought people were going to be knocking down their doors, but that's not going to come when the performance on track is not there.
Exactly. Oh, well, I think we'll see that unfold over the next couple of weeks. And there was also, I believe Toto said, and I'm paraphrasing, not directly quoting, that he saw like a large decision being made soon that would kind of make his decision for him, which to me kind of sounds like they're making a choice on Carlos somewhere. Carlos is probably close to closing his deal, and that sort of takes that, bargaining chip off the table, so to speak. But I don't know. We'll see what comes out in the next couple of weeks. But I do think the Mercedes situation, I almost feel the longer they go without signing someone, the less attractive they get, because if they cannot fix the car or fix their results, you're looking at, instead of going to, the team that was number 2 last year, you're looking at a team that can barely compete to be in that top 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think that exactly sums it up. It wouldn't surprise me that if Carlos was that first domino to fall, I mean, obviously Lewis was the first domino to fall,
Sure.
but that next domino to fall in like the driver market silly season activity that we start to see, just because of the available drivers, he seems to be the hottest commodity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I want to talk about, like on the other end of the grid and the other end of the driver market, so to speak, is Logan. Because one of the things I always do right before we record is I ask, like in the Discord server and on my Instagram stories, is there anything you want us to cover about the race? Which also, if you want to be able to contribute to those questions and you're listening, you can follow me on Instagram, or you can join the Discord server, which is in the description, and you can ask your questions for next week, I promise. But one of the top questions that a lot of people asked was like, do we think that Logan is doing enough this season to keep his seat? Because obviously this race, if you just look at the results, he came in 17th, which sounds nicer than 20th until you remember that 3 people did not finish the race, and so it was last. But I think if we look at the actual race itself, and James Vowles' kind of like recap on Instagram afterwards, basically he said, like, we saw that the car had better pace. We saw that Logan was able to pass people this weekend in the race, and that we ultimately like kind of messed up on our pit stop, which was a problem. There were a lot of people that came in to the pits at the same time, which caused some issues in terms of exiting, and we lost some places there. And then there was a small driver error turn, which threw him into the gravel, which kind of just, ended the race at that point for him. But I do think his point of the fact that like the rest of the race, we actually are seeing some decent performance from Logan and from the car. I'm wondering how much of, if we get to the end of the season and Logan is kind of up for a seat or not up for a seat, which I don't see being another team, it would be with Williams. How much of this issue do we look at and say, like, it is the team's issue, it is the car, it is the funding, versus it's Logan not being a good driver?
I think for this season, at least, we need more data points because we really only have two races where we are able to or like see how he compared to Alex as his teammate. And I think really that is the gap that Williams is going to be focused on, because I think James Vowles realizes that there's only so much that that car can do. But when you're looking at someone like Alex Albon, who is seemingly maximizing the potential of that car, I think Logan needs to close that gap significantly in order to keep his seat, because we saw, especially last season, Alex placing in the points or right around there most of the races, and Logan was consistently at the back. He needs to be much more closer, like much more towards like the 10th and 15th like ballpark, in order for, I think, him to have his seat be saved. And if it wasn't such a crazy driver market year, I think that his chances of keeping the seat might be better. But because there are so many people that are going to potentially be available, like, I think if this is just like a crazy hypothetical, but if Stake were to keep Joe and then bring in Theo Pourchaire instead of Valtteri, like, I think that Valtteri finishing his career at Williams could be a great storyline, and that's something that could kick Logan out of his seat. Like, I think that there are just going to be so many other drivers that are going to be available that if that gap isn't narrowed, it's just going to be hard to justify keeping him. And it is unfortunate because I like that there's an American driver on the grid, but he just hasn't shown that ability yet.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it will be easier to judge starting around Miami and after, because I think that's when we're going to see like less of a stress about car parts and chassis and all these different things that are sort of extenuating factors right now to Logan's ability to perform. And so I think after Miami, or maybe starting with Miami, if we start to see that he is consistently, 19, 20 over and over, then I think it really is a situation where it's like, okay, we did our best. We gave you 2 years, and there are better opportunities on the market. But I think if we start to see him make those improvements, then you can sort of write off the first 5 races of the season and say, okay, it was our fault. We were dealing with a new wheel. We had the spreadsheet situation, which was such a wild. There are so many other factors to Williams's lack of performance this season that I think if Logan can pick it up and keep it together starting in Miami, like even giving him China and just being like, do your best. Hopefully you have a car to drive, and we'll see. But I think if he can pick things up after China and really start to perform in that like 15th and above space in Miami and moving forward, I think they may be able to say, okay, look, let's write off that first section. All of that was not our fault. All of that was our fault. It wasn't your fault. And now you've kind of consistently performed. Plus, I think if he does start to perform at that point, then he has the narrative of like dealing with the adversity of, the lack of confidence in him, in order to drive in Australia, and dealing with the press and the conversation about that, being able to sort of like bounce back from that, I think is also a positive if he's able to do that. And I do think there is a conversation about like the fact that Williams is making this effort to be sort of the second American team behind Haas. Like we're seeing them make those attempts, and I think there is a business decision in that, and that is probably part of what keeps Logan in that seat, or what kept Logan in this seat this year as well. Like they did their car launch in New York. They took an American driver on for F1 Academy. We're continuing to see this sort of like attempt to have part of that American fan base. And so I think if he can pick it up, I'm not even saying he has to start, scoring points, but if he can not be in the last 5 slots consistently for the remainder of the season, I do think there's a shot, but we'll see.
Yeah, I just think with all of the turmoil that Logan and the team as a whole have had these first few races, like the conversation is really just premature. And I think that we need to wait until around like the summer break to really have a more meaningful conversation about whether or not he deserves to keep his seat, because like you said, they'll have fixed their car issues. They'll also have gone to more of what are like the traditional like European tracks. Like all the races so far have been newer tracks or street tracks, with the exception of Suzuka, but there was all of the car issues at play. So we'll have to see. I definitely think that, like last year, they're going to be one of the last teams, if not the last, to make their driver pairing decision, no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll be interesting because they also, I think, have to start thinking about the fact that when Alex's contract ends, he is most likely moving up somewhere. I think he is becoming more and more of a commodity the further we go. And he is through 2025. So I think there may be a conversation of, do we need to have someone in Logan's seat that is prepared to take the team over when Alex leaves? And if Logan can't do that, then do we need to start training someone else type of thing? I don't know. A lot of factors, as always, but we'll see.
And the other factor is the Mercedes factor. Does Mercedes potentially pressure Williams to throw Kimi Antonelli in that seat for a year?
It's possible. It's possible. And I think personally, I would be a little bummed if that were the case, if that's what he loses it to, because I think there has been this conversation that Alex might move into that Mercedes seat eventually, and to like move him up would be another conversation about, are they only taking someone on for a year? I've seen some people say that they thought that that was the plan, and that was like they were going to, you know, have Lewis on this one and one option because Alex was through 2025. So if they looked at it from the sense of saying like Lewis retires at the end of 2025, we bring Alex up to Mercedes, and then we put Kimi Antonelli in that Williams seat, and then depending on how George and Alex perform, eventually we move Kemi up to Mercedes, but trying to set a kind of build a bench, so to speak, that they don't necessarily have in the same way right now. And I think Lewis deciding to leave is what's thrown a wrench in that possible conversation.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely like of those possible scenarios, I think that is definitely one of the least likely just because Williams seems to be trying to distance themselves from Mercedes and like the perception that they are just the Mercedes like B team, kind of like B Carb is to Red Bull. So I'm sure James Vowles will be very resistant to that, but it's not something that you can completely count out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, like, it's just so hard to read what they're trying to do the same way that we're trying to read why they put hard tires on the car. Like, it's the, it's a mystery to me. We are simply missing a lot of facts, I think. So we'll see. In the midfield, we also had McLaren fumbling the bag, I would say, to some degree. We had a really strong qualifying performance to a very disappointing race performance itself. Lando, ever the self-deprecating guy, also kind of said so much in the word in his post-race interview. And I don't know, I'm wondering how we feel about where McLaren sits, because Australia was obviously a fluke, so to speak. We had a team that was basically off the board that takes those first two spots, but we did see a Lando podium. We thought we might see an Oscar podium. Like, we saw very, very high performance last week to a completely different result this week.
I don't have like a ton to say about this just because to me it feels like the McLaren pace just isn't quite there yet. And we know historically that they start the season out slow, both like literally and figuratively. So I think that it's just going to take time, but the fact that they are where they are compared when you compare it to where they were last year at this time, I think that there is still like a lot of good to come from McLaren as we transition into Europe later this spring, early summer.
Yeah, I hope so. I would love to see. I kind of feel like it's possible we're going to see McLaren and Ferrari being the ones to fight for those upper spots, though I think Ferrari is pretty dominantly in that second place, which was something I wanted to kind of touch on. Was like, at this point, it almost feels like we were thinking, okay, Red Bull's gonna be, the winner no matter what, and we'll see people compete for second and third the way we did last year with Ferrari and Mercedes. But looking at Ferrari this year, they've been on the podium every race, and we even had a Ferrari 1-2 in Australia when we took Red Bull off the map. And I'm starting to wonder, like, do we simply have two teams that are incredibly dominant and then everybody else? Because Ferrari is not so dominant that they're close enough to Red Bull to start competing, but we are seeing, like, in Australia, when you take Red Bull off the map, Carlos is just as successful in finishing with such a large gap that was really only closed between him and Charles because he was like, bring him closer so that we can celebrate our 1-2 together at the end of the race. And I'm wondering if we're even going to see a competition for P2. It's early to tell, but
Yeah, at this point, Ferrari definitely seems to have that number two spot on lock. And I don't want to get like too optimistic because we know that Ferrari just has a way of messing things up sometimes. But it seems like Fred Vasseurs' tenure there has done wonders for the team, and they seem to generally have fixed a lot of their car problems. They've fixed their tire wear problems because we saw Leclerc pull off the only successful one stop of the race today. Like a lot, they fixed their strategy problems for the most part. A lot of the issues that had been plaguing them in these recent seasons seem to have been like tightened up and are really coming together. And so maybe that was just the missing piece that had been holding them back and was keeping them like competitive with Mercedes and McLaren last year. But I still have hope that McLaren will continue to progress this season as they did last, and that we'll at least get some good competition. But I'm also not going to be mad about the fact that Ferrari has that second tier spot locked down all to themselves.
I know as a Ferrari girl, you're like, it's good, it's fine, I don't care.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain for sure.
No, yeah, literally fine. It's fine. Speaking of McLaren though versus Ferrari, the one thing that I think I saw a lot of people talk about was the choice to swap Carlos and Charles in the race, like, taking Charles effectively off the podium to do that. And the argument was that they were worried about Lando and Lando kind of passing, making it up, and that Carlos had more of a pace, which I do think he did have more pace, but I don't know that Lando was really this threat that we think it was. And I know it was more of a every once in a while in F1 we have these more emotional things that have nothing to do with driver performance where you want to see certain people on the podium, and I think a lot of people wanted to see Charles on the podium this race because of the anniversary of Jules and his helmet that he wore and his post that he made that was quite emotional. And I am curious about whether or not that swap was actually necessary to defend Lando because we really didn't see a threat later in the rest of the race. And Carlos, obviously, it's good to see him succeed. And objectively, like, he did have the pace. He was faster, and taking that pass, makes sense from that side, but it's always one of those things where you're sort of like, okay, but wouldn't it have been nice? Wouldn't it have been nice story-wise, just let him have it?
I don't think that there was really any threat from Lando, at least in my perspective. I think that was like definitely a team orders in disguise sort of situation. Like they knew that they were going to get a lot of flack for that decision after the fact. And so they were trying to soften the blow as much as possible. And I have to say, there have been times where Charles has been the one behind with more pace, and they've told him to hold position. So it was really unfortunate that they couldn't kind of like return the favor for Charles, so to speak, in what was such an important race for him. I wish that they would have just let them fight it out, or like what they did in Monza last year, because I think that this has been an emotional weekend. You can tell for Charles, and it would have meant so much to him to be able to stand on that podium. And I think that it would have like really pulled on all of our heartstrings, even more than just like all of the tributes to Jules and all of that already have this weekend.
Yeah, and I think it was hard because it's one of those things where it's so rare in a sport where you feel like someone should get something regardless of if they, put in the performance to earn it, so to speak. Like, if we're talking just numbers with no emotion attached to it, yeah, Carlos, you know, outperformed Charles and should have had the podium. But emotionally, it's hard when you look at it and you're like, okay, but it technically wouldn't have affected the result. It would have been fine to let him keep it and to move forward. You still would have had the same points for the team. Um, so yeah, it's hard. I think it was very clearly a very emotional weekend, and I thought Charles' post was very beautiful, and I thought the helmet was gorgeous, and it was just hard. It was hard to watch, but I think it's one of those things where, again, like, we're not on the strategy team. There could have been something that we don't know about, and it's hard to make those decisions. I always sort of feel like kind of it's like the worst kind of backseat driver. I'm like, well, me, if I were making the decision with all the numbers, I definitely would have let him do what he wanted. Like, it's like, yeah, sure, but I'm sure there's something we're missing and all of that. But just emotionally, it would have been a nice kind of button on the weekend, I guess.
I also think it's a little bit debatable whether, like, to say that Carlos outperformed Charles. Like, obviously, at that moment in time, he was faster because he was on fresher tires. But
Mm.
Charles put in an incredible race. I mean, obviously, he got driver of the day, and he pulled off that one stop and made up three positions because of it. Like, Carlos was really only on, like, had the upper hand because he had that, like, upper hand with the starting position to begin with.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of like pure on track performance, I think that Charles wins out. Carlos just had the edge in track position.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, actually. I agree with you. So I guess I've what's the word I'm looking for? I convinced myself that it was fine, and now I'm back to feeling like he should have had his podium. So thank you. Anytime. Yeah, it's like it's so interesting too because it's like oh, next year I will be a deep Ferrari fan because I'll follow Lewis wherever. But it's interesting because from the Ferrari perspective, I really do feel like I'm just watching it, in respect of like it'll be interesting to see how Carlos does. I do love like a revenge era narrative where you see people kind of like really show up despite the fact that they have been kind of, passed over. But I also like it's a balance. It's like I can't decide. I'm like, oh, we'll see. We'll see. I do think it's nice to be able to talk about Ferrari in this world now as opposed to last year and years prior where the strategy was just so baffling that you were just watching them throw things away. It's great to be able to say, obviously very early in the season, but to be able to say like, oh, well, they're choosing between which driver is going to get to be on the podium. They can perform in that way that can be the debate that we're having versus like, why are we calling both cars in for a pit stop at exactly the same time? Like those were the choices that we were making before.
I agree. I definitely like this kind of discussion about Ferrari much more because it felt like every race last season, I was just like, I don't want to talk about it. Like, that was horrible. What are they doing? I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, they very much have passed that over to Mercedes, where it's just like that was I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, 100%. I saw so many memes today also.
Always rough, always rough. And, I think we'll see them attempt to rebuild soon, but it's rough to watch. And the other thing is like for me, I'm very excited to see what Ferrari looks like next year. If this is anything to go by, we've made some really good choices and I I desperately want to see Lewis retire on a high note because right now it just feels like he still has the driver ability. Like you look at what he was able to make up. He let George pass him when they were on those hard tires earlier in the restart, and by the time he was like able to get the car back on track, and still on those tires, he had a 10-second gap to make up, and he almost made up most of the gap. Like, he was within 2 seconds, and he did not have a number of laps. So it's like, there's sometimes I see people talk about, like, he's past his prime, but objectively, when you look at it, he is still an incredible driver that still has something left to give, and so I really am excited to see Ferrari working in this way where we're seeing a lot more, performance, we're seeing a lot more strategy calls, and we're seeing a good car so far. Um, I'm excited to see Lewis move into a place that seems to kind of ha very tentatively. I'm so nervous to, like, put this out there without knocking on wood and, doing whatever, like, throwing salt over my shoulder or whatever else you're supposed to do, but, like, I'm excited to see him potentially moving somewhere that seems to sort of like have it together because if we actually get to see him drive, I think it will be exciting to get to watch him return to the level of driver that we know he still is. Like he is still putting in that performance when you look at lap times, when you look at the types of things he's able to recover from. And so hopefully we also get to see him do that with Ferrari next year.
I think the future is definitely bright for Ferrari with Charles and Lewis. And I mean, we're seeing Fernando prove that, like, in this sport, age really is just a number, and you can be doing this and competing at that top level well into your 40s. And I think that Lewis certainly is also somebody that has that in him. And next year, I think, is going to be great. But what I'm even more excited for is 2026 when we have the change in regulations, because from what we know so far, it's going to move away from being aero heavy and will be more about engine. And we know that's something that Red Bull isn't necessarily strongest with. And I think that that's something that in the last engine dominant era, we saw Ferrari being more competitive. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I think next year will be an acclimation year. And then 2026 is when they're really going to go at it with Lewis. And I can't wait to see what that looks like.
2026, Lewis becomes his 8-time world champion, and everything is just roses. That's what I'm looking
He gets
forward
the
to.
eighth that he deserves.
His ninth. Okay.
Yeah, I
It'll
mean,
be.
I'm also in that camp.
I don't know if you saw, but he addressed that in his GQ interview where he was like, "Was I robbed? Absolutely." I was like, "Oh, we're just
I
putting it
mean,
out there.
everybody
We're
knows it.
saying
Like
it."
we've seen so many like drivers even slip and say like
Yes.
Lewis and his eighth. Like I think like I know like there's that clip of like Lando Twitch streaming. He's talking about stuff. He's like, yeah, when Lewis won his eighth, and he was like, oh no, I did not just say that. Like everybody seems to like except for the people at Red Bull seem to have the same perception of what should have happened in Abu Dhabi in 2021.
Feel like we all know what happened and it's fine. Like it is what it is. But it was when I was reading his profile and he just like out and out said it, I was like, "Oh my god, like there is no there was no like whatsoever attempt to kind of like couch it or be like, it depends on who you at." No, I was robbed and that's that. And I do think it's poetically I would really just like to see him have it before he leaves. So
Yeah, you said when we were talking about Carlos that you love like a driver in their reputation era, and I do think that Lewis going to Ferrari is like Lewis entering his reputation era 100%. I do want to chime in and say Yuki got his first points in his home race.
oh
I don't think we
yes.
talked about that. And that's one thing that just like brings so much happiness to my heart, and seeing him and how happy he was, how happy the team was for him. It just like made me like tear up a little bit, like scrolling through like the Instagram posts. Like it's just so heartwarming, and I'm so happy for him.
The picture of him sitting on the shoulders of the V-Carb garage team, I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna cry." I love it.
They also posted an old video of him like karting, and then like little baby Yuki on the podium. And that clip's been shared like everywhere. But every time I see it, I just like love it so much. Like he was so adorable as a child.
I know he's so feisty and fierce, but I'm like, "Listen, I could put you in my pocket though. Like, I love you." I really am a big Yuki fan.
I think that when he's off track, he really is like just seems like such a sweetheart, but like he can flip that switch on track and like be that like have that competitive edge that he needs to
Yeah.
have. But
There was a really sweet clip of him in Drive to Survive where it was at Japan last year, the Japan race last year, and he like walked over to some fans that were standing on like a balcony and was like, "Can I sign your hat for you?" And they threw his hat down and he threw it back up. And like those little moments every once in a while with Yuki, I think he is just such a sweetheart. I don't know how would feel about like that being how people feel about him because I think he does have like a very feisty and fierce personality and has become a fiercer driver over time or a more fierce driver over time. And so I don't know that like, a racing driver is looking to be called adorable, but I don't make the rules. I just I just report the news. So I think I just think he has like a soft, very adorable behavior about him and that childhood clip of him, I'm like, "Oh, I love you. I love you."
yeah, he's definitely one of my favorites. It's like the if he has no fans, I'm dead. Like that is me and Yuki. Like I love him so much.
I love him so. Yeah, we're Yuki's number one fan club. We're available. That's the summary of this race.
100%. Yes, sign me up. I'm there.
Well, heading to China next week, and hopefully we'll see both Williams cars on track to do so. Do you have any predictions for the race or overall season predictions?
I don't know. I feel like China is going to be a bit of a wild card just because they haven't been at that track for so long and it's a sprint weekend. So it is like the drivers are going to a new track essentially, and having it be a sprint weekend where they really only get one practice session to acclimate themselves. It seems like from what I've heard, obviously I wasn't watching F1 the last time they raced in Shanghai, but it seems to be another track like Japan and Australia that is going to be tough on the tires. So I'm really hoping that there is a lot of tire strategy at play, kind of like what we saw this week. And I'm actually going to be there in person and have seats across from the pit wall. So hopefully I get to see some of that action happening firsthand.
How exciting. I'm so excited for
Yes,
you.
I'm
Safe
very excited.
travels. Well, that'll be amazing. I can't wait to hear all about it and see some videos from the race. How exciting. Um, I do think you're right though. I do think just by the nature of it being a track that they haven't been to in so long, it's going to be potentially a bit chaotic and I think we'll get some excitement on track from that, which will be interesting to see. Hopefully it's not the type of chaos that like, results in crashes or anything like that. I'm hopeful that it's more about like surprise in performance of cars that you weren't expecting to perform better. Um, I would love to see McLaren kind of pick it up this week, and hopefully they do. Um, and we see a good, strategy. I think it'll be like you said, like hard on the tires, so an interesting strategy call. And hopefully no one says the word hard tires to me again.
Yeah, I think as far as from the chaos perspective, I think that first corner that's basically like it's like a loop de loop to me, where they come all the way around and then go back through. Like that on a race start has to be insane. Like it wouldn't surprise me. I'm sure it's a great corner for overtaking as well, but it wouldn't surprise me if we saw some sort of first lap incident with that corner specifically because it just seems like a nightmare to drive.
Agreed. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for hanging out with me and recapping Japan with me and celebrating Yuki's first points with me. This has been so much fun. If the people of the internet would like to find you and find your cool legal takes on F1, where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. If you want to check out some of my content and follow along with my Shanghai Grand Prix journey, I am at Legally F1 on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, and then also have an up and coming blog at www.legallyf1.com.
Yeah, so if you are not following Lindsay, make sure to drop her a follow. Find her at Legally F1 on all platforms. Personally, I think she has a very different perspective than necessarily the rest of the content creators that you're going to see in this space. So definitely try to take a look and follow her there. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to us recap Japan and that we covered everything you were looking for. And I will see you for the next race. As always, if you don't want to watch these races alone, you can join the actual grid chat. I host a group chat of motorsports fans where fan behavior is encouraged, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. We watch these races live together, chat about breaking news, and of course, send each other an unhealthy amount of memes. If you'd like to join the grid chat, you can do so at tandemproductions.com/grid chat. There will also be a link to that in the episode description. Once you fill out the form on the webpage there, you'll get an invite via email from me. If you want to connect, let me know what you thought about the episode, or even just ask me another question that you'd like me to cover on the show. You can find me on all social media platforms at Marissa Kamari. And one of the best ways to connect with me is if you're listening to this podcast on Herd FM. You can find me in the community section on Herd FM, where my username is just my first name, Marissa. And once we follow each other, after every episode that you listen to, I'll be able to comment and have a conversation with you directly. So again, my username on Herd FM is Marissa. As always, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and thank you for joining the Grid Chat.